I am telling this now because I survived it, and because the danger in my house was not a ghost or a nightmare, but a living man who built himself a hiding place inside my walls and came into my bedroom while I slept. 5 years before everything happened, my husband died from a sudden stroke. And after the funeral, I stayed alone in the small 2-story house we bought together at the edge of town, where the nearest neighbor was a long walk away. The house was quiet, surrounded by dry land and an empty lot behind it. And I had no children and no visitors, except for a grocery delivery once a week. For 5 years, nothing unusual happened, and I followed the same routine every day, locking the doors at sunset, checking the windows, and going to bed at 10. The first sound came on a cold night in November when I heard slow footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. And I told myself the wood was expanding because the heater had just turned on. The steps came again the next night, spaced evenly from the stairs to my door. And again, I told myself it was the old house settling, because I did not want to believe anything else. A week later, my bedroom door moved an inch inward while I was in bed, and I stayed still and said it was the draft from the broken window seal at the end of the corridor. In the morning, I found my husband's framed photo turned face down on the dresser, and I picked it up, set it upright, and decided I must have knocked it over without noticing. 2 nights after that, I woke up because the mattress dipped slightly near my feet, and when I reached down, my hand touched only the blanket. So I convinced myself I had shifted in my sleep. I started placing small objects behind my door before bed, like a glass and a hairbrush, so I could see if anything moved during the night. And every morning, they were slightly out of place. I checked every window lock and replaced the back door bolt. And I even installed a new chain lock on my bedroom door. But the footsteps did not stop. One evening, I found a glass of water on my kitchen counter that I had not poured, and the level was half empty, as if someone had drunk from it and left it there. The next morning, the bathroom cabinet was open, and my toothbrush was wet, and I had gone to sleep with it dry on the shelf. I began counting the cans in my pantry and marking them with a pen on the bottom. And within days, 2 of the marks were missing, as if the cans had been replaced. I searched every closet, every crawl space I could reach, and the attic hatch above the hallway. But I did not see anyone, and I did not find broken locks or forced windows. After another week, I woke up to the sound of slow breathing near my bed, steady and human. And when I turned on the lamp, the room was empty, and the door was still chained from the inside. I started sleeping with the lights on, and I pushed my dresser against the bedroom door each night. But the footsteps continued in the hallway, as if someone was pacing and waiting. One morning, I found a second key under my pillow, old and worn, shaped exactly like the house key I kept on my keychain. And I knew for certain I had never made a copy. I held that key for hours at the kitchen table, trying to understand how it could be there when I was the only person who had ever owned this house since my husband died. I stopped leaving the house except for brief trips during the day, and I began checking the attic again, this time climbing up with a flashlight and a hammer in my hand. In the far corner of the attic insulation, I found a narrow opening cut between two beams, hidden behind stacked boxes that I had not moved in years. The opening led into a hollow space between the walls, wide enough for a person to lie down, and inside I saw an old blanket, empty food wrappers, and plastic water bottles. I realized someone had been sleeping above my ceiling for months, listening to every movement I made, waiting until I locked myself in my room before climbing down through the crawl space. I did not call anyone, and I did not leave, because something inside me wanted proof and wanted to see his face. So I bought 2 small security cameras from a hardware store and installed them in the hallway and the kitchen. That night, I locked my bedroom door as usual, left the dresser in place, and sat awake in bed watching the live feed on my phone with the lights off. At 2:43 a.m., the attic hatch moved slowly, and a man lowered himself down with careful steps, wearing dark clothes and gloves, and he walked directly toward my bedroom door, as if he had done it hundreds of times before. He stood outside for a full minute. Then he crouched and slid something thin under the door, and I heard the soft click of my chain lock being lifted from the outside. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. Then continue seamlessly with he pushed the door open slowly, while I remained in bed, pretending to be asleep. And I watched through barely open eyes as he stepped inside with the confidence of someone who believed I would never fight back. He moved toward the dresser first and touched the framed photo of my husband. Then he turned it face down again and placed it exactly where it had been before. He stood beside my bed and leaned close enough that I could see the outline of a scar across his chin. And he stayed there for several seconds, as if studying my face. Instead of touching me, he walked to the foot of the bed and pressed both hands onto the mattress, testing my weight and the way I breathed. And then he stepped back toward the door. I understood in that moment that he had been entering my room night after night, adjusting objects, drinking my water, and standing over me while I slept without ever waking me. When he left and climbed back into the attic, I did not move for an hour. And then I quietly slid out of bed and wedged a heavy chair under the attic hatch. The next night, he tried to push the hatch open, but it did not move, and I heard him shifting above the ceiling for almost 20 minutes. On the third night, the noises were louder and more frantic, and pieces of insulation fell through the edges of the hatch onto the hallway floor. I realized he was trapped inside the wall space, without access to the attic exit he had used for months. And the only other way out was through a narrow vent near the back of the house. I did not remove the chair, and I did not unlock any doors, and I stayed downstairs listening as he moved through the hollow spaces between the walls, looking for another escape. By morning, the house was silent, except for faint scratching from behind the kitchen drywall, and I knew he had not left. The following day, I found the vent cover in the backyard bent outward, but still attached, and there were traces of blood on the metal edge where someone had tried to squeeze through and failed. That night, the scratching turned into pounding from inside the wall near my bedroom, and I heard his voice clearly for the first time asking to be let out in a low, urgent tone. I did not answer, and I did not open anything, and I stayed on the couch with a kitchen knife beside me while the pounding continued for hours. By the second day, the sounds weakened into irregular knocks, and then into dragging movements that traveled from one wall to another as if he was crawling. I cut off the electricity to the attic area and left the house dark, except for a small lamp near the front door. And I stopped turning on any water taps so he could not reach a pipe. On the third night, there were no more knocks and no more movement, and the house was completely still in a way I had not heard since my husband was alive. I waited another full day before removing the chair from the attic hatch, and when I opened it, the air that came down was heavy and stale. I climbed up with a flashlight and found the narrow cavity where he had lived, and this time he was lying on his side between the beams, motionless and pale, with the empty bottles scattered around him. He had tried to crawl back to the opening, but there were deep scratches in the wood where his hands had slipped, and there was no space left for him to turn around. I stood there for several minutes, looking at the small bed he had built for himself above my ceiling, and the path he had used to enter my room, and I understood that if I had opened that hatch when he first pounded, he would have come down alive and desperate. Instead, he had remained inside the walls of my house until his strength ran out, and the man who had lived over my head for months never walked out again. I sealed the opening with thick boards and cement the next week, and I sold the house soon after without telling the buyers what had happened inside the walls. I live somewhere else now, in a small apartment with concrete ceilings, and I still check every door at night, even though there is no attic above me. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.